Hello and welcome to another episode of the Classical Republican. Today we are talking with Lars Doucet, who is the author of Land is a Big Deal, and we're going to talk to him about Henry George and Georgism. So, thank you for coming on today. Really appreciate that. Um,
Howdy.
can you tell us a little bit about your journey um, through distributism onto Georgism?
Right. I'm assuming your audience might be somewhat familiar with distributism, but just in case they aren't. So distributism is this philosophy that is popularized by people like G.K. Chesterton, and it's kind of encapsulated by the phrase solidarity and subsidiarity, which means, it kind of captures some of the kind of moral imperatives of a lot of the worker movements of the early 20th century and late 19th century, um, but without the without the specifically hardcore materialist vibe that you saw in socialism and communism and Marxism. It was very much came out of Catholic social workers movements and sort of things. G.K. Chesterton kind of summed it up with the phrase, 3 acres and a cow. And the idea was basically another way to sum it up is, again, just with G.K. Chesterton, was the problem with capitalism is not that it produces too many capitalists, but that it produces too few capitalists. And the idea was you wanted to make sure that you had as many owners in society as possible rather than just a couple of large, big owners. I think it was Francis Bacon who said that wealth is like manure. When it's piled up in a big heap, it just stinks. But when it's spread widely, then it produces, much prosperity and growth. And I was introduced to distributism through my priest. I'm not Catholic. I'm Eastern Orthodox. Um, they're, I suppose you could call them Catholic adjacent. And I was introduced to an author by the name of John Maddai, who wrote a book called Toward a Truly Free Market. And Maddai is Catholic. And he wrote, it's basically kind of distributism 101. And I was very taken with the idea. And embedded within distributism is this movement called Georgism, which they kind of see as an allied movement. And that was when I first heard of Georgism. And Georgism is basically this movement that is very concerned with land in particular. And the distributists, of course, see that as like a really instrumental thing that needs to be done. And Georgism is typically presented as kind of a very narrow movement. I think it's actually potentially much more expansive than it's first given credit for. It's basically often characterized as just people who are obsessed with land and that's it. But basically, the premise of Georgism is that land is the root. Land and the policies that govern it are the root of a surprisingly huge amount of inequality. And socialism and capitalism have spent the last century like beating each other up over, whether it's workers or bosses who are the enemy. But Georgism really thinks that the main problem is that we don't share the land. And if you look back through human history, almost all human conflicts at root are about you have the land and I want it. And if we could figure out a way to share the land, we could actually kind of cut the Gordian knot of the struggles of the last 20th century, and in fact, most of human history. That's kind of how I got from there to here to there. Is that I first encountered Georgism through distributism, and then later I just continued to learn more and more about it.
Interesting. Would you say that Georgism is the way to implement distributism? Because a lot of distributists that I did talk to on my with my series didn't really have a really a concrete way to implement it, and some of them even worried that they were going to look like socialists. If I mean that's a big problem with distributists. They don't want to be they don't like socialism, but they're a lot of people will call them socialists because they want wide distribution of wealth.
Right, and so that's basically the thing is that distributism is at its heart essentially kind of it's kind of a moral framework, which is fine. I love moral frameworks, right? But it's not so much an instrumental and economic framework. It's mostly concerned about moral justice and distributive justice, but it doesn't get but it kind of like just sets up these precepts of like what is good and what is just, but it doesn't like really lay out a plan for how to get there. And I do think Georgism is it's not the sum total of what you would want to do to achieve distributist ends, but it's a huge part of it because the basic insight of Georgism is that there's three factors of production, things that come together to make stuff. classical economics basically treats there is only two, labor and capital. And Georgism splits off land from capital and says land is not capital. Everyone else treats it like capital, but it really isn't. And so it gives you this third thing to change the distribution of and change the rules about in a way that's more equitable. Otherwise, all you have left to distribute is the proceeds from people's labor or the proceeds from people's capital, right? Which is either like, which is basically either, we're either taxing, investment or we're taxing labor and then redistributing it. And that's kind of, the two basically prevailing schools of thought we've had so far is either, capitalist trickle down economics, which is like, let the capitalists keep as much as possible and then just count on growth to solve the inequity problem. And then the socialist thing is like, well, we're going to take a hit to growth and that's okay because we need to just punish capital and tax that and redistribute it. And then you kind of have the neoliberal approach in the middle, which is like, well, let's just tax a little bit of everything, tax a little bit of labor and tax a little bit of capital and, just have a good mix. And then we kind of like tinker around the edges and redistribute it, but not enough to make people mad. And basically the Georgist argument is that really the only thing that's just to tax is non-produced assets, things that nobody made. Like just intuitively, if you work, you should be entitled to the product of the things you have produced. And if you invest, you should be entitled to, you should be rewarded for saving up the proceeds of what you've worked for and then reinvesting them and putting them at risk. But if you just basically, were the first one to arrive in a location and plant your flag and basically be like, I just own the earth and I just own this, and whether that's natural resources or land itself, and basically exclude people from what's essentially a monopoly, you shouldn't be entitled to proceeds from that because you really haven't brought those proceeds into existence. God brought them into existence, and you're just gatekeeping access. You're just a troll who's charging everyone, a toll to, in effect, you are extracting from other people's labor and other people's capital in order to, charge them for the right to access the natural world, which is our common inheritance. And so I think in that sense, Georgism is the instrument way you achieve distributism. Distributists, on top of that, are very fond of like worker-owned co-ops and stuff like that. And I'm kind of agnostic on that. Like, I think worker co-ops are interesting in principle. If someone can show me how to achieve them at scale and solve some cold starts problem, I'll get a lot more excited about them. Like I'm not opposed to them. I just like, it's always is just like whenever I start a new company, it's just easier to just start a traditional company. That might just be the bias of our existing towards them. But that's like kind of the other thing with distributism is they're very interested in co-ops. So I think Georgism is the way to get around the accusation of being socialists who want to take people's hard-earned work, people's hard-earned capital, and just pass it around to, politically connected, winners and losers.
You mentioned the natural resources, and a lot of times we don't. Yeah, that's like we've kind of bifurcated that in a separate into a like when it comes to planning and zoning, we have a land ownership, but that doesn't give you the right to the natural resources. That's you get a different permit for that, and that has to be zoned a certain way in certain places. Do you think does Georgism kind of rely on the old English common law idea of the freehold, where you have land and you have the right to do whatever you want with it?
Sort of. Well, so Georgism is actually pretty opposed to the English fee simple title system, which is so where Georgism differs from socialism, because the socialists will also say like we need to share the land, but when they say we need to share the land, what they mean is that we need to physically redistribute it. And I will admit that that's often better than allowing land ownership to concentrate in the hands of just a few private people. But I don't love the idea of central planning with what we do with the land. I think that's actually very bad. And so the Georgia system, I feel like, is the best of both worlds, is that the land value belongs to everyone, right? The value the land produces, the land rents, and I can get into what that means, right? the economic return to just holding land belongs to the community. But I think it's more optimal for society if there is someone who's in charge of deciding what is done with the land, because I very much believe in, free markets where individual actors are able to make decisions. And so I think you want a title system where people, which is similar to the English title system, where you own the land, but you just pay a land value tax to compensate society for excluding people from it. This is different from the socialist system where it's like, okay, the state really owns all the land, and the state also decides what to do with it. And then you get all those inefficiencies from central planning. And I feel like what we actually have right now in America is kind of the worst of both worlds, because we say we have a free market and that you own land, but you don't really have freedom to decide what to do with land you own. You own it, and in many places you have fairly low property taxes. Not in every place, but in some places, especially in California, with Prop 13, if you got lucky to be grandfathered in. So you might so the value of the land is not being shared economically, but the state is still centrally planning what you can do with it, with parking minimums and zoning and setbacks and all these things that have nothing to do with like basic building code safety or not having slaughterhouses in neighborhoods. It's like there's all these just completely arbitrary decisions on what God-fearing, red-blooded American patriots can do with their own land. So you can't really say that you really own the land if you can't make a decision of what to do with it. So the Georgia system is very much, you should have the freedom to do pretty much whatever you want with the land, and within reason. And by within reason, we mean like actually reason, like building codes, but not zoning. And then, but the economic value of the land should be shared with the community. And that's what we want, which is kind of the flip side of what we have now, where you have no freedom to actually build what you want. But all the economic value is privatized, which means the principal reason to own land is as an investment and not as a productive asset.
Okay, you've already kind of mentioned it, but the land value tax, can you define that for us?
Yeah. So land value tax is kind of, George lays out his principles of what he thinks is right and just. We need to share the land, but how do you do this, right? And so there are ways you can do it. Like you could have the state own all the land and just lease it out. And, we can argue about whether that would be good or not. What George prefers, though, is for individuals to control what to do with the land, but pay a tax. And that tax is basically a compensation, because it's a compensation for all of the value that your land attains value because of public spending and because of your neighbors' activities, right? And both of those are an economic argument for sharing the value of the land with everybody. So how do you do that instrumentally? Well, you have a land value tax. It's similar to a property tax, but it doesn't tax any of the building's value, right? So because those are improvements, that's capital. That's not pre-existing unproduced nature, right? You're only you're only being charged for the economic value of having exclusive control of this area. And so in practice, it's a property tax where buildings are exempted from taxation. And George's other insight is that he would prefer to capture the full rental value of the land, which means what that means is that it's not like 100% of the selling price. What it means is that whatever you could basically charge in the market for leasing out the land, you would charge 100% of that every year. In practice, this amounts to like 5 to 10% of the selling price of land every year would be maximum Georgism. And most people are willing to settle for much, much less than that, given the status quo so far away. So 50% Georgism would be 2.5 to 5% of the selling value of land every year, but only the land and none of the buildings.
All right. So the so that's that's what I hear about a lot. The LVT, the land value tax. Are there other elements of Georgism that are important? I mean, sure, maybe back when he came up with them, but are there elements that you think are still important today and can be applied? I mean, say you're running as a candidate on a Georgist political candidate, and the LVT is just too unpalatable politically for your constituents. What would be other elements that Georgists would push?
Yeah, well, so you have some practical examples of that out of Norway right now, for instance. So Norway is actually arguably a very Georgist nation. I think it's often misconstrued as a socialist nation. I mean, it can have a little socialism as a treat. Let's be quite clear about that. Um, it being um, social democracy and all that. But Norway's natural resource policies are very Georgist, and so Georgist management of natural resources is something you can do if LVT is not on the table. And I'm a Norwegian citizen. I was born in America, but my mother's a Norwegian immigrant, and a lot of my family lives over there. So I'm a dual citizen of both nations, and it's been an interesting perspective being both an American and a Norwegian because in Norway, their resource policies around oil and hydropower are basically exactly what George would have recommended, even though they don't have land value tax in Norway. And so, what I mean by this is that the oil and the water for hydropower are pre-existing resources that are given by nature, given by God, that no person has created. And so it doesn't make sense to reward someone basically for just getting to them first, because what inevitably happens is that then there accrues what we call a resource rent, basically the economic return to just gatekeeping access to a natural resource. And this is really the natural inheritance of Norwegians. This is their resource, and some company, which in their case could be a foreign company, right, just gets fee simple title to an oil resource, and then they don't really have to work too hard. They can just wait for one. They don't if there's demand for oil, they won't necessarily start drilling because they're like, well, the price could go higher, so I'm going to wait. And then two, they might not invest much in safety or in environmental protections. They might set the ocean on fire, like happened with Pemex and with British Petroleum, right? And so, because it's like when oil flows out of the tap, they just make like free money. But at the same time, you have to discover the oil first before you can do any of that, and that involves a lot of capital costs. So what Norway has done is they have a very effective, just empirically effective system where they have a very high severance tax on the extraction of the natural resource, but they have very generous subsidies for the discovery of the resource. So all of your R&D and all of your discovery costs are covered, so that ExxonMobil can't whine about how, oh, we need to have a monopoly on these resource leases. Otherwise, we won't be incentivized to discover it. It's like, you can discover it for free. We'll pay for it. But once you find it, 95% of that value belongs to the Norwegian people. And hey, why are you crying? Like, you got there for free and now you're making 5% profit. Like, just go for it. And this basically aligns incentives perfectly. And it really encourages really wise stewardship of the people's resources that were freely given by God and not created by any man. And why this is really important with natural resources is if you don't do this, you get what's called the resource curse, or a familiar or a related concept called Dutch disease, which we've seen in all the Middle Eastern countries, for one. We've seen it in America in certain places. We certainly saw it in the South when we became dependent on slavery because of cotton, especially after the invention of the cotton gin. It made cotton extraction more efficient, which just increased the demand for slavery and kind of set the stage for the Civil War. It happened in the particular parts of Appalachia where you had all those coal miner strikes and riots and Pinkertons coming in and slaughtering people. Where the company just passively extracted resources and didn't invest in people. And the way you avoid the resource curse is with these high severance taxes, but then to encourage discovery, you combine that with subsidies to discover. And what's really ironic, the reason I say that Norway's system is very Georgist is that the hydropower system, doing this for hydropower resources, it was actually put into place by Norwegian Georgists at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And then what's really interesting and kind of ironic, everyone tends to ascribe Norway's success in petroleum, frankly, to what I perceive as a Norwegian, to like this really bizarre fetishization of just like our magical Viking ethnic superpowers. It was an Iraqi immigrant who set up the Norwegian petroleum management system. His name's Farouk Al-Qasim. He's a Knight of the Order of St. Olaf, and deservedly so. He basically saw firsthand the resource curse in 1950s, 60s, 70s Iraq. And when he came to Norway, he's like, I don't want to see the same problem happen here. And so when we discovered oil, we had no natural expertise. But he came, he's like, this is how you make a private public partnership that actually works. This is how you dodge the problems of the American oil extraction system, where everything's privatized, and how you avoid the problems of socialist oil extraction systems in places like Venezuela, where they have like naive nationalization. Now, Venezuela hadn't happened yet, but other things of that model certainly had before, certainly in his own homeland of Iraq. And so if LVT is not on the table, I think natural resources are a perfect example of something you can manage like that. But there's also other non-produced assets that fall into this category of what we call economic land. Things like electromagnetic spectrum. Froggy 99.7 is occupying economic land that is scarce on the radio frequency. Same with orbital real estate, right? Who gets to launch a satellite and stay there forever? Right? Should someone be rewarded for launching a satellite just to park and take up a space and then charge other people to access it in the future, right? Especially when we have issues like, what is it called? Kessler syndrome, where little bits of broken up satellites are going to cause all kinds of damage in the future, right? So I think we could have land value tax for orbital real estate and for electromagnetic radio spectrum, and that would make sure those would be allocated much more efficiently. And I think, those would be some of the first things I would look towards.
Interesting. What is the best way and what is the worst way to implement LBT?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So one of the worst ways is there are some really bad land taxes, right? A good example would be council tax in the UK. Or is it council tax or is it stamp duty? I think it's called stamp duty. Stamp duty is a tax in a lot of Commonwealth nations where you have to pay to transfer. It's basically a sales tax on real estate, which is just encourages people not to sell. And it's a land value tax that's only applied when you sell the land, which is awful. So that's a bad idea. The other way is to just do land value tax with extremely outdated and terrible assessments, right? If you haven't done every place land value tax has been implemented and it's been repealed, it's usually been because they let the assessments get out of date, like haven't done assessments in 10 years, or they're based off of really outdated methods. Like we have a lot of state of the art methods. We know how to do accurate land assessments in 2022, but not every place is using them. So if you're doing an aggressive land value tax without accurate assessments, you shouldn't be surprised when your constituents get sticker shock. Another bad way to do land value tax, I think, is to do it without making another unpopular tax, a sacrificial lamb, right? I think you should. The goal of Georgism is to reduce other taxes, like reduce sales tax, reduce income tax. The dream is the single tax, where land value tax, natural resource taxes, and things like that are the only taxes you have. So if you have a state income tax or you have a state sales tax or local versions of those, if you're raising the rate of taxes that falls onto land, you should also be decreasing some of those others. That's why one of the first steps and now one of the better ways to implement an LVT is what I call, what others call the split rate property tax, which is you pass a measure that allows local jurisdictions to set differing rates of the tax that falls on buildings and the tax that falls on land within the existing property tax system. You pitch it as property tax reform, right? Everyone loves property tax reform. And so you tell people we're going to reduce all the taxes on buildings, hopefully to zero. And when you do this, you're basically making the building tax a sacrificial lamb. And that is going to shift your taxes. It's going to unproductive land. It's going to shift them to parking lots and vacant lots and things like that. You do this in the first step by keeping the amount of dollars of tax collected the same, but the tax incidence of where it's collected from changes. And so that's not going to put you in this immediately scary situation where homeowners are going to get soaked first, right? It's going to be downtown parking lots, especially in places like Houston, that are going to get hit first, right? Really, really, really valuable downtown land, because downtown urban land is the most valuable land, right? And so the land that's being utilized the worst is going to feel the pinch first. And I think that's a palatable first step. I think later, we do need to, have a hard conversation about the suburbs, but that doesn't need to be the first conversation. And when you get there, I think pairing it with a citizens dividend, which is basically a Georgist universal basic income, where basically you take all this land rent that you're collecting, and instead of just sending it all to the government, you share it with the community. That's the whole point, right? That is going to offset some of the pinch of people who are like, hey, well, how am I going to pay LVT on my home, right? So it's going to encourage better building usage. It's going to encourage people to actually build rather than hold very, very valuable land out of use. It's going to cut down on sprawl, but it's also going to balance out the worst places. And then also, people always bring up, it's like, well, what about the poor widow who's going to have to move out of her home because she has no income and she's on a really valuable plot of land? It's like, well, her estate can pay the land value tax when she dies, right? We can defer payment for those edge cases, just to be politically palatable and frankly fair, to people who wound up on the bottom half of changing the rules to a more equitable state. There's always winners and losers. So you just cut the losers some slack. You give them some time to get through the transition. And I think you just do it step by step. And I think it always starts with a very accurate assessment of what all the land is worth, so that you will not be surprised where the political opposition comes from, so that ahead of time who's going to pay more and who's going to pay less. So you can be very intentional in making sure that you have a winning political coalition before you go through with this. I think that's the mistake a lot of people make, is that they just don't do the math ahead of time.
All right, thank you.